Croptastic, the podcast by InnerPlant. I'm Ariel Patton, and I'm a director of product at InnerPlant, also the creator of the Topsoil newsletter. And today I'm joined with Shelly Arnoff, our CEO of InnerPlant, and Dan Northrup. And for those of you who don't know Dan Northrup yet, he is very experienced across a lot of different facets of agricultural R&D. And he has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. He's operated at startups, including Benson Hill. He's worked with government agencies before doing research. And today he works at Galvanize Climate Solutions, evaluating various scientific investments there. So with that, Dan, I'll let you kick it off and talk a little bit about your recent thesis here on wine and diamonds and how that relates to agricultural inputs.
Sure. And, really, this was inspired because of what Ariel wrote, or like a survey that Ariel had flagged from Purdue, which is just looking at different crop categories and the reasons why farmers buy things. And, we sort of talked about this. I was going to say, like, just put the article out on Upstream Ag. So it's called Our Ag Inputs More Like Wine or Diamonds. People can flag it, read it there or just listen to it. And the question was like, trying to compare two different product categories. One is wine, where the primary purchase reason is what it says on the label. These are just different reports. Comparing with diamonds, where you have to buy according to the 4 C's, is a sort of set of really quantitative characteristics that people can measure and agree on and so forth. Whereas, again, in wine, it's much more subjective. I thought what was interesting in the survey that Ariel highlighted was that each one of those decisions applied to different ag inputs, whether it was fertilizer or seed or chems or other crop production, other aspects of crop production. That you kind of had both types of buying. There's like wine type buying, where it does seem to be more label driven or performance driven, versus things that are really more commodities that you could fertilizers, where you could just measure the nitrogen or the phosphate content or so forth. Getting back into the performance-based ones, I think the question, and thinking where I am, like, at what point do you know that the product's going to perform? In seed genetics, we highlight this. They're extremely well characterized. The companies will probably measure them. InnerPlant will have to do this on different backgrounds, where it'll be measured in hundreds of sites. Whereas some of the ag chem might only be measured at a tenth of those sites. If there is environmental inputs, it was just like, is the data even available to make this call that it really is a performance product? And is the marketing material you get sufficient to really make an ROI-based decision? Or is it just sort of like trust me, closer to the way it is in the liquor store, when you're saying like, oh, you're gonna love this wine, and it's like, what are you having for dinner? Like, I'm having fish or beef or whatever, and as a consequence, you got to have this one. And then you tell a little story about the vineyard that doesn't have anything, that's going to have something to do with how you enjoy it, but not anything to do with how the wine tastes. So kind of as a product developer and innovator, you guys know where I've been. It's like, at what point can you actually sell and really capture the value of your product, which you have to estimate for pricing? And at some point, I'd love to write about that. It's like, how do you price a product that you don't know that it works? And I don't know how people, you say it best, Shelly. Something's worth what people pay you. So, you could do that.
You don't know what it's worth until someone pays you for it. Then you.
No, totally right. And so you have to say from the get-go, like, this product is going to add 10 bushels of yield. And so that's like $50.
Right. Wait. So let's, I think this is a good place to stop. So my big thing that's always bugging me is this data really representative of anything, right? And we've talked about this a lot. All of the data that's compiled around ag products is essentially tested in very quote unquote manicured lawns trials. So, I mean, I'm assuming if you're testing a fungicide, you're selecting high fungal pressure fields versus not. If you're testing seeds, you're treating them the best you can. Maybe that's the closest to like actual data, but they're not really experiencing any environmental stress whatsoever in those experiments. And then when the farmer has to buy it, then that's not the reality, right? So Ariel and I talked about this when the farmer is saying, this is my field is different. is the field different because he knows that's the issue, or is it that he doesn't trust the data because he doesn't, why would they trust the data?
Yeah, I think it's also how complex each of the products are. Like if we're looking at seed, crop protection, fertilizer, I think just the complexity of the product is also going to change and interact with that variability in the environment that you mentioned, Shelley. So I think it makes sense that fertilizer is a lot more commoditized. There's a lot less loyalty to your specific fertilizer, company brand, whatever, because it's less complex, and that's why, Dan, it's like more of a diamond type purchase versus like wine, where there is so much complexity at like a chemical level, a brand level, all these different psychological level, whatever you have there. And that's more of like the seed type purchase, where it's like it's a complex product that then is going to interact with a complex environment. So you don't know what's going to come out on the other side. You can collect a lot of data and try to get your best guess, but there's a lot of, it changes on that spectrum of complexity or not.
Yeah, well, just making it. The thing is, there is quality in wine, of course. It's a bad dichotomy because you can also get great at drinking wine. And I have a friend that tells us a really awesome story of touring a vineyard, and they're being served some of the wine to taste, and then his friend, who is a very talented wine taster, tastes the wine, and she goes, "Oh, guys, don't drink it; it's off." And he was like, "Oh, it tastes fine. What are you talking about?" She's like, "No, no, don't drink it. I'm gonna call the staff over, just let them know what's going on." And the staff like heard her and then very quickly said, "Please come with us." And then they laughed and they're like, "Most people don't know the difference. You clearly do. Let us give you like the real tour." And they spent a bunch more time with them, and they actually walked through the whole portfolio of wines with them. And so I actually don't think, to this point that you're making, there is quality in each one of these products, and what you want to get at and pay for. People would say they want to pay for return on investment. So it's like, I think you got to think of your point's really well made. The return is basically going to be the yield, and then the investment obviously is what you pay for the product. And so, but the correlation between how you use that product, or the number of times that you use the product the same way, and what the yield outcome is. So like, the cost of investment stays the same, but the yield outcome can be really complicated. With
But
fertilizer, it's still really complicated.
how do you calculate the yield outcome? We talked about this, right, a lot. How does you're running an
Well, I think
experiment
it's
with
exactly what you're
yield,
trying to
it's
estimate by
100
all the
different
tests.
things.
Yeah, no, but it's the purpose of doing the testing, right? Is to figure out what's the yield outcome. Or if I use this chemistry, I don't need to use as much of another chemistry. And
Is that the outcome? I think that you do the testing so that you can put out the marketing materials.
There's probably, I mean, there's definitely both. There's testing because, for product efficacy, as much as you can internally. And then I think probably at a certain point in the pipeline, then it becomes, how do we get the most compelling proof points and more of that marketing angle. But I think, I mean, maybe this is naive, but I do think that there is there's definitely product testing, for both of those purposes, performance and for marketing.
Okay. So let's talk specifically about fungicides, right? Because we spend so much time thinking about fungicides. I've never seen anything but the marketing of products, different fungicides by different companies, saying that their fungicide outperformed the competition by 3 to whatever, 8 bushels an acre. I've never seen anyone say this fungicide actually is a parity, or maybe it's like not as good as our other fungicide. So tell me, how does that work? What does that even mean?
I mean, I imagine with a certain amount of, it's such a high hurdle to get a product registered that all the duds get filtered out early, is what I would guess.
So you
So
mean this is better than like something that doesn't work, is what they're saying.
probably, or the, version 1.0, previous version. And obviously there's probably a lot of art in choosing what are they positioning against when they say it's an 8 bushel advantage. And so there's a lot of marketing art to that, but it's, you don't see the studies that it fails because a lot of those products probably don't make it through to that point. But I do think that like really good, agronomists and whatnot would be able to, that's the art of like product placement, where to put certain fungicide when, the 4 Rs, all that good stuff. Like, I think that's where you get the real, how does this specific product interact with this specific complex environment? And that's where you
Sometimes
see.
Oh, I'm going to jump in because I thought of an interesting parallel here with the wine analogy, because sometimes it's the measurement or the perspective of addressing value depends on a perspective of the industry, what the industry wants to do, but then B, also the technology. So take, for instance, like chili peppers, right? So probably everyone's heard of Scoville units, and they were invented by like a pharmacist in the 1800s or something. And it's really subjective, right? You take a bite of a pepper, and then however many times you have to squirt your tongue with sugar water is like how you come up. And so your tongue is different than mine. And so they do like many people doing it and then take an average. And that's the Scoville unit for the Carolina Reaper versus the habanero. It's subjective, but it's a means at least to kind of measure it, right? And so now there's a high performance liquid chromatography, which actually measures the molecules of capsaicin, which is what your tongue triggers on. And so they have this more objective way of measuring the chemical rather than the subjective way, which is kind of a good measurement. But and Scoville units are still really popular because the industry likes it, because you can talk about, it's a million Scoville units as opposed to giving some
Well
kind of
known.
molecular. Yeah, it's well known. And so I think that's kind of where we're talking about, is like at what point, like where's the inflection point, A, I guess conceptually from an industry standpoint, but B, like technologically, because it sounds like there's a little bit of a technological barrier, just being able to isolate the individual components of like what is this actually doing.
But that's actually the point, right? Like when we run experiments in controlled environments, we cannot change more than one parameter at a time, because then it's a false experiment, right? How can you do that in the field? So by definition, you're not running experiments. So then is there ever a true ROI or quality purchase in that universe?
So yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to like some years yes, some years no, and it's like, and we've been trying to think about this more, and that's kind of in writing the article. The point of the poker analogy is that like you got to think of it as a range of outcomes, and then the likelihood of those different outcomes, and then come back to an expected value rather than, it's not like every year you're going to do three bushel gain or whatever, 2% yield gain every year. Those actual yield curves are pretty noisy. Over time, the long trend is toward an increase. And so, yeah, like it's in some ways like a fungicide, depending on when you can do it, is a bet against a weather pattern that supports fungal growth against one that doesn't, or geography that supports fungal growth more often than one that doesn't. And so, but that's the impossible thing. And it was a great comment at the InnerPlant Summit back in Atlanta when somebody said, like, it's a horrible strategy to stay alive on average, and that doesn't work. And so you have to
Who
think
said
about Bruce sharing, and it was a comment, kind of a clap back at my colleague Bruno Basso, who I think has made great points that the best way to fertilize your field is to pick based on the long running average of yield in that section of the field. And there are sections of the field, and there's whatever, the two people arguing, so that they both had, I think, points that really score and points where Bruno's right and Bruce is right, and but that point is like, I guess that's this point of like, yes, there is a true probability of 10 bushel yield gain or a 5 bushel yield gain or a 3 bushel yield loss. Maybe no yield loss, but you're going to lose profit because you paid for a product that had a neutral effect. Can you ever get to that level of data? So I'd actually pushing back, and this is not, I'm not a plant breeder, but so speaking a little totally outside my domain, but I think what they'll say is that the performance in a perfect environment actually is a pretty good indicator of how things are going to perform an average across the landscape. And that's why they've worked that way over time. They've found that it's a good indicator. And then the interesting thing, and this is again kind of coming from colleagues at Iowa State, Australia has focused much more on understanding G by E interactions. And the reason is that they don't have the large geography to test over that we've managed to do here. So here you can just do the experiment and not try to understand the environmental effects and sort of observe your way through it, observe your way through the variability that we're talking about. When you go there, there's just not enough. There weren't enough research sites, so they really focused on that interaction of genetics by environment in their plant breeding. I'm still, shoot, if someone could call me after this plays and explain that to me a lot better, I'd really appreciate it. Because I think, you know, the point is, how do we, and then this is sort of the second phase of the article, is like, how do we get enough data to start to substantiate these much more quantitative approaches? Like, if it is observational, and we know that product testing is extremely expensive, like depending on how you do it, the question is there a way, you know, farmers farm every year, you know, there are many ways to test products in the field, and I think you could do it with the right technology so that you're not putting a lot of yield at peril. So there's this optimization and of how do you wring the most out of what happens in a field in a given year, and you do this by field design and rates and so on, and then really good statistical analysis on the back end to start to look at that. I think, you know, it's creating a different role, and we've had some sponsorship. A colleague, Matt Meisner, and I had some sponsorship from United Soybean Board to look at ways that growers could structure themselves. I think other, you know, partners at Tenacious, or not partners, but friends at Tenacious Ventures have profiled a number of like farmer adoption pathways and companies that are really selling testing services in the process of farming to try to get that data and then really constrain the ROI against the product. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, there'll be some losers because some products don't perform quite as well. But if we could get closer to that point where, you know, better products shine, it also gives a way for growers to make better decisions. And I guess, you know, the other sort of story that I keep going back to, that thinking about in writing this article, is my father-in-law had a chance to interview one of the technical founders of Starbucks. So before Howard Schultz came along and, you know, blew it up into this global, you know, the company that we know today, one of these guys came in and he was like, you know, Starbucks they were selling beans at the time, but just for the sake of the story, he was saying like, you know, a cup of coffee is $0.25, and there's no way to sell a cup of coffee for $1. Like, it's just not worth it. And he said, 100% it's worth it. But the first thing is I have to teach people to love coffee. And he said, so that's my mission. I'll teach Americans to love coffee. And then once we figure that out, they'll want to pay $1 because they'll get the difference between what I'm making and what and what, you know, you would get in a lower cost cup of coffee. And so I think for product developers in agriculture, and then both for farmers to see better products, it's like, if you develop that sophistication to quickly churn through products and figure out what is good data to choose on, how to update, then and then the growers, the only way I see that you could get that amount of data is to have the growers involved in the loop. And it totally changes. I know there are growers that cooperate with companies all the time, but taking that much bigger, it really changes the relationship between sort of the average, let's just say next to the early adopters, that sort of maybe next, whatever you want to say, 95th down to 60th percentile, being much more experimental, changing practices much more often, and having a much wider diversity of practices on the farms so you get to observe different outcomes. Again, doing it in a way that you don't bet the farm on the trial. You're doing this in small blocks with equipment that is being run anyway and has these capabilities. And my, you know, understanding, I think all the, you know, certainly the yield monitors have the resolution. If you calibrate them right, most of the planters can do different things. All the sprayers can do different things. And it just changes the way the data is generated, kind of going back to the different approach. And you could, you know, there were several data aggregators that said, we'll just put a bunch of data together, kind of big data the farm and figure out what things do by having enough trial points, as opposed to this would kind of be a different approach where you're trying to get much more data out of each individual unit of data rather than, you know, putting it all together and hoping you can infer something on the back end.
And Dan, I think so. Is the idea that, I mean, today there are a lot of trials in product development, right? And like that's part of why it takes so many years, and only in many cases only the big guys can afford to do it, because you need so many different years of data, so many different geographies, soil types, fields, all that good stuff. So to get the like N that you need, it's pretty much a long timeline, and it really favors only the biggest players. And so is your idea really then that this could be a little bit more democratized, where there could be smaller product developers in the loop, because there's more data coming in from more farmers being involved with that kind of thing? Is that the idea?
Exactly. And the other thing is, I think it's amazing. We've been following all this news about glyphosate lately, and it's a question of like, is the set of ag inputs that growers use going forward going to change dramatically in the next couple of years? That might not be the right example, but are other things going to change? And then, of course, there's everybody, both on the company side and on the grower side, I think would love to use biologics. But meanwhile, there are so many of them. It's like working through that whole process and coming up with a set of decisions in a faster timeline. And I'll say,
I think then, but you
I
talk
guess I
about,
want to say, I think it's everybody in the ecosystem. It's that you want more product developers to come in, but if you have more product developers to come in, the customers have to be faster at moving through those products. Otherwise, there's no incentive on either side to develop new products if you can't get it in, or to test new products if you don't know that they work. Buy new
but
products. I mean,
so here's the thing. It's like, because you think about it like a scientist, right? I feel like it's like we've had this discussion in the past. Like why don't they run more experiments, the farmers? And I think about it as a business person. It's like at the end of the day, either the customer gets the value of doing something for you, or even better, just don't have them do anything for you. You figure it out, right? So at the core of everything we do is, if there is value for the customer by enabling this new level of data that we're generating, then the customer is going to participate. We take away the effort. It has to be that way, right? There cannot be effort of running these trials. At the end of the day, everything has to be seamless. You have equipment that's basically now so smart that really everything can run through it. What's lacking is who's benefiting, right? And we can walk through this very many scenarios. Like, do the companies want to, the big companies, do they want to erode trust, or do they just want to keep the system as is? If you're a biological startup, do you want efficacy data about your product? Because everything works in ag in some areas of the field. Nothing works 100%. I think it makes a ton of sense to pay for where you're getting value. That will probably solve the equation for the producer and the farmer. But there's like a learning curve there that's going to be painful for one side, right? And the only way to just resolve the whole thing is you take away the opaqueness. So the data will just essentially make everything very transparent. And then what are you going to do? How much can you fight transparency? But you can't ask the farmer to do it. Like, you can't be like, yo, guys, like, just run a ton of experiments. Come on. How hard is it to do this other thing for me?
I
No,
do wonder if that additional data, if more data will make it actually clearer, or if, because I think that still puts a burden on the customer in many ways, to interpret the data and make sense of it in a way that makes sense for their farm. And so I do wonder, I think more data, is always a good thing. It is a good thing, but I think sometimes ultimately, will it work for my farm? That question there's still some step of interpretation that needs to happen between there.
But again, why does the farmer have to do that step? There's so
Right.
many tools today, right? We just
Right.
do the whole thing for them.
Or is there a trusted advisor in that loop,
Right.
that interprets that? And another thing too, I was thinking through, Dan, as you were talking, is a lot of farms, and when we talked with our inner circle customers, other farmers that I've chatted with, a lot of them already do a ton of, on-farm trials, R&D, that kind of thing. but a lot of it isn't necessarily in the service of a specific product evaluation or product development, but it might be for, you know, different management practices and certain things like that. So I do think that there is a lot of that experimentation. And so I'm wondering if your thesis here is more around like, how do you harness that, get that get that information in a way that can be more shareable and applicable to other farms.
Yeah, 100%. In both, it's like, you know, you get that data in, and I'm sure all of us get different reports or something about your life, and then it's like, yeah, what should I do next year based on that? And that actually, and the academic role I have, that's one of the things we're thinking about hardest is like, so yeah, that could be the next role for extension. I met, you know, one grower kind of talking about this right now who actually spends more money on data analysis than accountants right now, because exactly what you're saying, like they're like, we need to understand everything that's going on, and that's the staff that we need, that we bring in. So, you know, right, in this case, maybe they bore the burden, and you always, to your point, somebody's always doing, there are always people pushing, you know, big edges, whether it's in business model or testing, but that sort of like sensible update, like for example, you did that experiment say last year when the spring was extremely wet. If it was a germination trial, that might not be the best year to react to. Like, you want to downweight, I think you want to downweight data out of certain years and upweight in others. We're doing this again academically, but I really think they're going to be useful tools both for product development and for thinking about where to do certain interventions. And you and I both know I work on nitrogen fertilizer. It's like you model the year and then you can model 40 years. And so we could do really good, I don't do it, but my colleagues model really good nitrogen responses. And that's what those models can underlie going forward, these claims about the linkage between yield and fertility rates. As an example, like that's one that we can't estimate really well. And, you know, I'm so disappointed. We could get a grower, but I'm really excited for a future podcast when we do have, I think, a super ROI.
No, actually on that, we will have another part 2 with Dave Hula. And then you should think through the questions that you're going to ask the farmer.
No,
maybe we'll let him
I think
listen
it's
to this first.
And I actually think, you know, David and then his colleagues, one of the things they emphasize so much is stand early in the season in germination. If like, I think if you get into a field, and we're trying to think this through, like Ariel, to the point, if you had inconsistent germination across the field, what difference does it make? And your yield is your outcome. What difference does it make if you run a good trial? Because you probably introduce so much variability on the day of germination that the trial is worthless. And so it's like, if you put that data in, you get some great result or some super negative result. You know, it could be either way. It's a data set that's not good. And I don't know that we have that appreciation of like a sort of a quality metric for the data, which involves the layout or, you know, a hailstorm or a flood or something like that, where you had a yield outcome in that year. It just happens. And that's the other reason.
You want to do that, but you also don't want to somehow cherry pick your data, which would be the other side of it. But
no, 100%. That's right.
100%. No, you can add guidelines, right? But let me ask you guys this, because like, I mean, on the first deck to pitch InnerPlant, I'm pretty sure I had that already, which was every farm is gonna become a trial plot. What's holding us, honestly, from having every farm be an experiment today? There's literally, I don't think, any barriers, but it's not happening.
I think there is a farmer mindset, and I think there's a lot of, you know, the more progressive farmers that are, you know, every year is an experiment. They're, even if it's not recorded digitally, in their mind, they could tell you, you know, what happened last year and the year before and the last time it was a wet year like this, and certain outcomes. So I do think there's
that's
that
nice,
mindset.
but that's like, you know, asking Rod to do like in his head experiments. I don't love it. Why is it not recorded? That's, you can't be like, I remember
you're saying
that year
why
was bad. That's,
why is
you
it
know,
not digitized?
It's not
I
like
mean,
a great way to run your experiments.
Totally. I think we're just in things take time. And if you think about what equipment has been out there, how long it takes for different, like newer fleets of equipment to be deployed that can record all of these different data points, like we're still in the early innings of that. And there is so much more data than, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So I think we're on that journey. I mean, I'm optimistic about it. But it's like the real three-dimensional world. There's so many different variables and there's so many things that we don't know. Like even if you think about like the teaspoon of soil has billions of organisms, like there's so much, above ground that we can start to look and map out and use all these different tools, satellite, et cetera, to measure and monitor. But there's so much
Yeah,
even below the
so
surface we don't know. So there's just a lot of data out there and we're just early innings on collecting it.
But I don't know this, and I wouldn't think about this if we didn't talk, but I think it's like you should get, there's a ton of value in the data if you do it right. And so I think there is a role for early stage companies to go to farmers and work with them to teach it. And instead of, I don't know if you could set it up
No,
yourself or,
no, you have
working,
to. They have
there's
they
working through
have to have
CROs.
value. The reason that it's
Oh,
not
they're paying
happening is
for it
not
now in
because
other places. Yeah, that's right. They're paying for it
I
now.
don't think the value proposition is there for the farmers, right? Like the equipment is there. I don't know how much really is missing, but they don't see value for them. So why, right?
No, I think it's moving some of that R&D budget into on farm, and whether it's led by a group of growers who set up to do this, and then they're already there, and you see examples kind of largely out of commodity groups or at state levels. And I think it's just like it'll go more and more. We have one project in Iowa called the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative that's about 600 fields this year on farm nitrogen trials at sort of quarter acre scale. There's don't need to pay a lot. I think the growers really appreciate the information they get back on nutrient responses. And so, I think more and more it will come. And then as R&D budgets can get shifted into this when the capability is there, plus on the back end, it is going to be the ability to respond to the information quicker or slower, whichever one's more sensible. And again, it's kind of coming back to this question of just how do you move through products quicker and make better decisions in a world that's getting more complicated.
I think one thing on that, Dan, of like that farmers, that you said that they need to move through products quicker. I think that for a lot of farmers, they don't need to, right? Like what they're doing produces a really consistent, high yielding product today. And like they don't need to try new products unless it's clearly going to solve
Right.
something for them. And there is a certain amount of like just wait it out and then the cream rises to the top and let my neighbor try it and then if it really is a game changer I can get into it. So I don't know that there's that
That's a good
real
point.
urgency.
Ariel, and I would add to that too. It's like, do they even feel the need to run experiments to improve their fields, or do they feel like they're doing pretty well?
Probably different for different farmers.
Look,
Right.
I don't.
Dan,
So I don't know.
maybe there's
there's
not a
some people-
problem. Here's the thing. Is there a
Yeah.
problem to solve, right? Because like the other part of where you started with this concept was around separating the reality of what farmers interact with products and how they purchase them from like the investors. So maybe that's the problem that's really in the back end is that investors are investing in products and farmers are not adopting the products. And you're like trying to bridge the divide, but maybe from a farmer perspective, they're fine.
That's
So
a
look,
good point, in fact, because I think maybe like the problem that exists in the academic world because like the farmers, so like going back to your analogy of diamonds and wine, so diamonds have been traded by humans since humans could walk upright, right? And they didn't have the 4Cs, but like the local diamond merchant or whatever, the trader would just have an idea of like what made this diamond valuable, and all the little dealers had that in mind, kind of like the farmers now. They're all running to Ariel's point, they're all running experiments and they have an idea like that biological doesn't work, that varietal works, like whatever. and it's only when you start needing to share that information. So when you trade diamonds internationally, right, you need that homogenized comparison. But like, does the farmer need that? Or I mean, I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out is like, what's the forcing factor for like getting farmers to a point where they need this, or do they need this? Is this just something for academics and for governments and whomever? That
Or
like,
investors.
is it their problem or is it the farmer's problem? Because if it's not the farmer's problem, the farmer is going to like
Well, hold on. You pull a grower or anyone, and it's like you can buy seed from 3 companies today. Would the world be better if there were 9 seed companies that sold to you, or something like that area? And I don't think that there aren't any problems, and that anybody, read the newspaper and say that the farmers are gonna be thrilled with the amount of money they make this year. Now, there's a million structural reasons why that's the case that farm testing doesn't solve, but it's
Right.
not like no sector can stay static. Like, things are changing. Crop selection could change. I think that people would appreciate having more people to shop from, which would give more competition in the upstream marketplace. Now,
100%.
again,
But wait, how is that solved by more trials or on
well,
farm?
to the extent that you said that this democratizes input sales. I mean, you have supply chain and all that I understand are expensive, but if they're cheaper to get to the fields, like in theory, a biological fertilizer provider, because the volumes are so much smaller and the logistics are simpler, there you could have many more of those. It's a less capital intense business type that would allow for more players. So I think, to the extent that you make product development cheaper and you get more competition that can sell, you make it simpler for product developers to come to the marketplace. And so, no, I think that this does create advantages. And yeah, no, I guess I would push back. I doubt you'll find too many growers that think I would love to be doing exactly what I'm doing today in 10 years and do it the same way, knowing I'm going to gain 2% yield per year because of the combination of genetics and management that we've done for the last 60 years. Like, it's like, yeah, I mean, there are, it's a tough economy. And I think
guess
people would want to do it. And to the point that, like,
It's a tough economy.
Well, and
It's-
I think it's the economy, right? It's
The economy
but when you
is
think
the-
about like, okay, here's a new product to give you more bushels. Dan, I think in a previous conversation we've had, you mentioned like there's not really that much more incremental gain from any specific product. You're not going to get like a 25% yield bump from some magic product. Like that we're just not there because we've really optimized a lot of these factors. And so I think that hopefully farming does evolve so that it is more, better for the farmer, more profitable, etc. But I don't know that solving for increased yield, yes, you can bushel your way out of it. Yes, you always want to produce more that is that within your control, but there is a limit to that. And I think a lot of these real pain points about markets, about, other aspects about the economy are not necessarily like product specific, unless you're talking about like the cost of these products going up.
yeah, I mean, you're right. I'll agree. I mean, there is, we've talked, yeah, we have talked about this. Like, and if we get a chance to talk to David Hula, like, this is he's consistently tripling the national average. Now,
Yeah.
whether it's not necessarily profitable, but there is so much more room up, whether there's markets to absorb that and so on. Again, there's a lot of questions like, what problem do you solve? In a year-to-year basis, though, you should.
Yeah. And I think that's
So yeah, look, and
clearly solve the problem here.
I'm just saying, like, I think if all of us thought that farming was going to be exactly the same in 15 years, then, like, I'm 45, like, I expect to work for 20 years. If it's going to be the same for 20 years, I'd rather do something else. This is going to
Don't
get
worry,
better.
it's
now,
going to be
Dan.
completely different. But I think that the path there is through technology and thinking about the customer not having the burden on them. We're getting there. But I think this is a
You
good
gotta do
point.
both. Like you need, but I think it's both. And I try to work on both sides of that, which is
Mhm.
to say that, like, again, if you're the one who really goes out and learns about wine or really learns about coffee, you'll find the product developer on the other side who's really excited to show you the next best wine or the next best coffee or really the next best ag input. I'll really quit with this story, which I thought was a great one about a grower who ran a test actually on fungicide and went back to the chemical company. I'm not going to say the one, and was like, you know what, that was $8, and I'll pay you $8 next year if you want it. That was $8 of value. We'll pay $8. If it's more, we're not going to use it. Anything less.
That is a great example. And that's
if
exactly where technology can come in and do that, right? And at that point, it's not subjective. It's not about liking the flavor of the wine more. It's about having a real knowledge of what that product produced for you.
That's right. And I would think the company would push back and say, well, you know what? It was pretty dry last year. So you know what? In a wet year, that $8 is actually going to be $20.
Yeah, but
And
that's
so,
easy. And then the grower can just say, by the way, farmer. Then the farmer can say,
well, farmer,
well,
whatever.
we'll see. We'll see if it's sunny or,
Oh,
not.
but maybe he or she'd take the bet at 13. And it's like, let's gamble together.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, clearly this topic, there's a lot more to explore. Dan, you got to think through the questions you want to ask Dave Hula. I mean, not that he represents the average farmer. He represents very much the not average farmer, but I think it would give us a good insight of, how do we get the farmers more involved in this process to move everything forward? So thank you all.